Footsteps echo on a road of ancient dust. We are traveling back to a time of profound faith and quiet mystery to follow the journey of a medieval pilgrim. By the end of our tale, you will understand the true human cost and courage behind these epic wanderings. We will uncover why ordinary people risked everything to walk across a continent and what secrets they carried in their hearts. What kind of hope makes a person leave their entire world behind? The world these pilgrims stepped into was one of sharp contrasts and profound uncertainties. Forget the neat maps of modern nations. Europe was a fractured tapestry of countless small kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, each with its own laws and local lord. A traveler might cross from one domain to another in a single day's walk, moving from a region of relative peace into a territory plagued by banditry or petty warfare. There was no central authority to guarantee safe passage, yet overarching this chaotic political landscape was one towering, unifying institution, the Church. Its presence was as constant as the sky, its spires the tallest structures in any town, its bells marking the hours of prayer that governed daily life. It was the ultimate source of authority, the keeper of knowledge and the gatekeeper to salvation itself. Society was rigidly structured, a pyramid with God and the Pope at its peak, followed by kings and nobles, then the knights who served them, and finally, the vast, silent majority of peasants who worked the land. For most people, life was a short, brutal, and unchangeable inheritance. Your station was fixed at birth, your future dictated by the soil you tilled and the local lord you served. This rigid social order made the idea of pilgrimage all the more radical. It was one of the few sanctioned ways for a common person to step outside their ordained place, to temporarily shed their identity as a serf or a craftsman and become simply a soul on a sacred journey. But what truly fueled this desperate need to wander was a worldview saturated with the supernatural. People did not see the world as we do, governed by predictable laws of physics and biology. Instead, they lived in a universe alive with divine and demonic forces. A sudden illness was not a virus, but a curse or a punishment from God. A failed harvest was a sign of divine displeasure. In this reality, relics, the physical remains of saints or objects they had touched, were not mere symbols. They were conduits of holy power capable of performing miracles, healing the sick, and washing away a lifetime of sin. A pilgrimage to touch these sacred objects was not a tourist excursion. It was a direct physical plea for intervention in a world that often felt terrifyingly random and hostile. It was an act of faith born from a deep, desperate hope for a better life in this world and certainty of one in the next. The road did not discriminate. It welcomed the rich and the poor alike, each footstep a verse in a vast, whispered prayer. Who were these souls who chose such a hard and uncertain path? They were not a single type, but a tapestry of humanity woven from threads of desperation, duty, and profound faith. At one end of the spectrum walked the nobleman, clad in fine wool, his journey a public act of penance ordered by the church or a shrewd political maneuver to gain favor with both God and king. For him, pilgrimage was a sanctioned exile, a way to atone for a violent sin or to quietly distance himself from a courtly intrigue. He traveled with a retinue of servants, his comfort a stark contrast to the masses. Then there was the merchant, driven by a blend of piety and pragmatism. He sought forgiveness for usury, the sin of lending money at interest, but his eyes were also open to new trade routes and exotic goods he might encounter in distant marketplaces. His pilgrimage was both a spiritual cleansing and a business venture, but the most common pilgrim, the one whose story is often lost to history, was the peasant. For the man or woman bound to the land from birth to death, the pilgrimage was a radical, almost unimaginable act of defiance against the rigid order of their life. They walked not for political gain, but for a miracle. Perhaps a child was sick, a wife had died in childbirth, or the rains had failed for a third straight year. Their journey was a last desperate gamble, a physical plea to a saint for intercession. They sold their few possessions to fund the trip, carrying little more than a staff, a leather pouch, and a desperate, blazing hope. Some were even forced onto the road by law, their pilgrimage a judicial sentence for a crime, a way to expel a troublesome individual from the community while technically offering them a path to redemption. So while the noble sought to repair his status and the merchant his soul's ledger, the peasant sought simply to survive, to find a reason to believe the sun would rise again on a less cruel world. Their motivations were as varied as the stones on the path, from the purest devotion to the most practical need to escape debt, famine, or a life of relentless toil. They all shared one thing, a longing for something beyond the horizon, something that promised to make the immense hardship of the journey worthwhile. The decision to become a pilgrim was never made lightly. It was a seismic shift in a life born from a moment of profound crisis or clarity. For some, it began with a sacred vow, a promise made in a desperate hour. A mother, watching her child burn with fever, might pledge to walk to the shrine of St. James if only her son would live. This was not a casual promise. To break such a vow was to risk divine wrath, a fear far greater than the perils of the road. For others, the call came in the silence of the night, a divine vision or a haunting dream. A common tale was of a saint appearing, bathed in light, pointing the way to their distant shrine. In a world where the veil between the earthly and the heavenly was thin, such a vision was a command one dared not ignore. Then there were those driven by the simple, agonizing need for a cure. Medicine was rudimentary and often powerless. When every local remedy failed, the only hope left was a miracle. A pilgrim, crippled by a wasting disease or blinded by infection, would set out with a final, fragile hope to touch a relic said to have healed hundreds. Their journey was a walking prayer, each painful step a plea for wholeness, but perhaps the heaviest burden was carried by those atoning for a grievous sin. A knight who had killed in a moment of rage, a merchant who had built his fortune on deceit, a person haunted by a secret shame. For them, the pilgrimage was a prescribed path to redemption. The endless walking, the blistered feet, the exposure to the elements, all of it was a form of penance, a physical suffering undertaken to scour a guilty soul clean. The road itself became their confessional. These vows, visions, and vexations were the deeply personal catalysts that transformed an ordinary person into a pilgrim. They set in motion a story of immense personal stakes, a soft-voiced tale of one soul stepping into the vast unknown, not for adventure but for salvation. Once that sacred vow was made, the pilgrim faced a monumental choice. Where would their journey lead? The destination was everything, a decision shaped by faith, finances, and the sheer number of days they could afford to be away from their life. 3 great routes called to the medieval soul, each with its own unique promise and peril. The ultimate goal, the most dangerous and prestigious of all, was Jerusalem. To walk in the very footsteps of Christ, to see the hill of Calvary and the site of the Holy Sepulchre, was the dream of every devout Christian, but this was a journey that could take years. It demanded crossing seas controlled by rival powers and navigating lands fraught with political tension. Only the most determined, the wealthiest, or those with nothing left to lose would attempt it. It was the pilgrimage of a lifetime, often taken only once, if at all. For those seeking a slightly less perilous but equally powerful destination, there was Rome, the eternal city. As the heart of Christendom and the seat of the Pope, it was a living tapestry of sacred history. Pilgrims came to pray at the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul, to witness the countless relics housed in its basilicas, and to receive blessings from the Church itself. The journey to Rome was still a test of endurance, a long trek across the Alps for many, but it was a known path, a road trod by thousands before. Then there was the third great way, the road to Santiago de Compostela in the far northwest of Spain. Here, in a cathedral of soaring stone, lay the remains of St. James the Apostle. This route became immensely popular, a spiritual highway cutting across Europe. It offered a unique social experience, a chance to walk with fellow pilgrims from every corner of the continent, sharing stories and hardships. The choice between these paths was deeply personal. A pauper with only a few coins to their name would likely set their sights on a local shrine or perhaps the long but land-based route to Santiago. A nobleman seeking to demonstrate his power and piety might fund a lavish expedition to Jerusalem. A sinner performing penance might choose the most physically grueling path, believing the greater the suffering, the greater the forgiveness. Their destination was a reflection of their deepest need, a compass point for a soul set adrift from the familiar, guiding them toward a glimmer of divine grace. Once a destination was chosen, the pilgrim transformed their very identity through a sacred uniform. This was not mere clothing. It was a suit of armor for the soul, a visible declaration that the wearer had left their old life behind and entered a state of holy travel. Every single item from head to toe was steeped in both practical necessity and profound spiritual meaning. The most recognizable piece was the long, heavy cloak, typically made of coarse wool. This garment was their mobile shelter, protecting them from the biting wind, the relentless rain, and the cold of sleeping under the stars. Its color was often a dull gray or brown, practical for hiding the grime of the road, but it also symbolized humility and penitence, a visual shedding of worldly vanity. On their head sat a broad-brimmed hat, its wide circle of felt or straw offering crucial shade from the summer sun and channeling rainwater away from the face and neck. Tucked into the hat band or pinned to the cloak was the most famous emblem of all, the scallop shell. For those walking to Santiago de Compostela, this shell was the ultimate badge of pilgrimage. They would receive it only upon reaching the coast near the great cathedral, proof they had completed the long journey, but its meaning ran deeper. The grooves of the shell, all converging to a single point, were said to represent the many paths pilgrims walked, all leading to one sacred destination. It was a symbol of divine guidance, a reminder that even in their solitude, they were part of a vast, converging stream of humanity. In their hand, they gripped a tall, sturdy staff. This was far more than a walking stick. It was a tool for testing the depth of a muddy stream, a weapon to fend off wild dogs or desperate thieves, and a support for weary legs climbing a steep hill. Spiritually, it represented the third leg of the Trinity, a physical manifestation of their faith propping them up when their own strength failed. And finally, tied to their belt was the scrip, a small leather pouch or wallet. This humble bag held their entire worldly wealth for the journey, a few coins, a crust of bread, perhaps a flint for starting a fire. Its emptiness was as important as its contents. It symbolized poverty and total dependence on God's grace and the charity of others. A pilgrim with a full scrip was a contradiction. They were meant to receive sustenance, not to be self-sufficient. Together, this cloak, hat, shell, staff, and scrip created an unmistakable silhouette on the medieval landscape. This outfit was a passport and a shield. It identified the wearer as a holy figure, a person under the protection of the Church and, by extension, God Himself. In a violent and unpredictable world, this garb was their best hope for safe passage, a silent plea for mercy, and a shared understanding that this soul was on a mission far greater than themselves. The morning of departure arrived cloaked in a quiet, almost unbearable sorrow. There were no grand farewell parties, no cheering crowds. For the pilgrim, this final day was a ritual of severance. They stood at the edge of their village, the only world they had ever known, and looked back at the wattle and daub hut, the strip of field they had worked since childhood, and the faces of family they might never see again. A wife clung to her husband, her tears a silent prayer for his safe return. A father placed a trembling hand on his son's head, a blessing and a goodbye in one agonizing gesture. Every embrace was weighted with the terrifying knowledge that this could be the last. In an age without letters or swift messengers, a person who walked over the horizon simply vanished from the lives of those left behind. They became a memory, a name whispered in daily prayers, a hope that flickered with each passing season. Before they could even take that first step, they had to settle their earthly affairs, a process that felt like preparing for death. A peasant bound to the land had to secure permission from their local lord to leave, a negotiation that often required a payment or the promise of a portion of any alms they might receive on the road. They had to arrange for a relative or neighbor to work their plot of land, to tend their meager livestock, knowing that a single failed harvest in their absence could mean starvation for the family they were leaving behind. For a merchant or craftsman, it meant entrusting their business to a partner, settling outstanding debts, and converting whatever wealth they had into the portable coins that would jingle in their script. These were not simple chores, they were the deliberate unraveling of a life, the tying off of every loose end because the thread of their own story was being stretched to its absolute limit. Then came the moment itself. The pilgrim turned their back on home, their staff striking the packed earth of the familiar lane for the final time. The sounds of the village, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children, the lowing of cattle faded with each step, replaced by the rustle of their own cloak and the quickening beat of their own heart. They crossed a stream, a hill, a stone marker that signified the edge of their parish, and with that they passed from the known into the unknown. This was the most profound psychological leap. They were no longer a baker, a farmer, or a mother. They were now simply a pilgrim, a stranger in every future town, a soul stripped of all identity except their faith and their goal. The road ahead was not just a physical path but a void, and their first few solitary miles were a slow, terrifying absorption into its vast and silent embrace. Every footfall was a question mark. Would they ever hear that familiar village laughter again? Or had they just exchanged their entire world for the faint, distant chime of a cathedral bell? The road itself was a living, breathing entity as changeable as the human heart. One day it was a crumbling Roman stone highway, its ancient paving stones a testament to a lost empire, offering a firm, swift path. The next, it could vanish into a sucking quagmire of mud after a spring rain, clinging to boots and hooves with a desperate, greedy weight. This path was the pilgrim's constant companion, a guide and a tormentor in the same breath. Its dangers were as real as the stones underfoot. Thieves and bandits haunted the dense woods and lonely mountain passes, preying on the very charity that sustained these travelers. A pilgrim's scrip, even with just a few coins, was a treasure worth killing for. Then came the animals, not the creatures of fairy tales, but very real wolves whose howls pierced the night, and wild boars that could charge from the undergrowth without warning. Even the promise of shelter was a gamble. A wayside inn might offer a warm hearth and a bowl of thin stew, or it might be run by a cutthroat who would slit your throat for the clothes on your back. The stories of dishonest innkeepers who drugged wine or hid robbers in the cellar were not just rumors, they were a genuine terror that kept many a pilgrim walking through the night. Yet for all its perils, the road offered wonders that could mend a weary spirit. There was a breathtaking beauty to the untouched medieval world, a sight we can scarcely imagine today. Forests stretched for days, ancient and deep, their canopies filtering the sunlight into a cathedral of green. They walked through valleys where the only sound was the rush of a crystal-clear river, and over hills that revealed vistas of rolling, empty land under a sky impossibly full of stars. This was a world without the hum of machinery, a profound silence that allowed the soul to breathe. And then there was the greatest wonder of all, the unexpected kindness of strangers. A poor farmer's wife, seeing the scallop shell on a traveler's hat, might rush from her field to offer a hunk of coarse bread and a scoop of fresh water. A shepherd in a distant valley might gesture to a dry corner of his hut for the night, asking for nothing but a shared prayer in return. These small acts of mercy were the miracles that happened not at the distant shrine but along the way itself. They were a reminder that the divine was not just in a relic behind an altar, but in the shared humanity between two strangers on a long and lonely road. The journey was a test of everything a person was made of, confronting them with the very worst the world could offer, only to save them with a glimpse of its very best. A silhouette on the horizon, growing slowly into a stone archway and a ringing bell, was a sight that could save a pilgrim's soul. This was the monastery, the ultimate sanctuary on the road. More than just a roof and a meal, it was a direct channel of divine grace made manifest through human charity. Upon arrival, a weary traveler would be greeted by a porter at the gate. After showing their pilgrim's credentials, they would be led to the guest house, a separate building maintained specifically for wayfarers. Here they received the three great mercies, a bowl of simple food like pottage or bread, a safe place to sleep, and often the chance to wash their feet, a ritual echoing Christ's own acts of humility. They might even be invited to attend the monastery's services, their journey blessed by the haunting chords of Gregorian chant rising into the night. This was not a transaction, it was a sacred duty for the monks, a way to serve God by serving the stranger, believing that in doing so they might be entertaining angels unawares. But the road held other kinds of havens, places with a more urgent and earthly purpose, the hospitals. Do not picture a modern medical center. The word hospital comes from hospitality, and these were places of care in the broadest sense. Run by religious orders, they were way stations for the sick, the dying, and the utterly exhausted. A pilgrim succumbing to fever or collapsing from hunger would find refuge here. The care was basic, rooted in the herbal knowledge of the time, but it was given with a compassion that was itself a form of medicine. A brother or sister would offer a soothing balm for blistered feet, a draught of willow bark tea for pain, or simply a clean straw pallet on which to rest. For a traveler whose body was breaking down, the hospital was a place where humanity was restored, where the fragile vessel of the body was patched up just enough to continue its sacred mission. Not all shelter, however, was born of charity. For those with a few coins or those who found the monasteries full, there were the taverns and inns of the secular world. These were places of stark contrast to the quiet reverence of the cloister. Here the air was thick with the smoke of the hearth, the boisterous shouts of merchants, and the sharp tang of cheap wine. An inn could be a welcome source of hot food and lively company, a chance to hear news from down the road or share stories with other travelers, but it was also a place of constant vigilance. The pilgrim had to guard their scrip with their life, sleep with one eye open, and navigate a world of haggling and potential deceit. This was the system of commerce where a bed required payment and trust was a luxury no one could afford. The pilgrim thus moved between two worlds, the selfless economy of divine charity in the monasteries and the gritty, risky economy of human commerce in the towns. Their survival depended on knowing how to navigate both, accepting bread from a monk with a bowed head one night and bargaining fiercely with an innkeeper the next. Their journey was a constant dance between faith in God and a very practical trust in the strength of their own staff. Silence was a pilgrim's first and most profound language. As our traveler moved from the familiar fields of their homeland into the river valleys of a foreign tongue, the comforting chatter of the world fell away, replaced by a wall of incomprehensible sound. In a single day's walk, the language of the local villagers could shift from a recognizable dialect into a completely alien speech, a river of strange vowels and consonants that offered no handhold for understanding. This was the reality of a fractured Europe, a continent of 1,000 dialects where the word for bread or water changed with every hill and valley, yet the journey had to continue. To survive, pilgrims developed a second language, one not of words but of gestures. A pointed finger toward the mouth and a cupped hand could universally ask for a drink. A mimed motion of sleep with hands pressed to a tilted cheek could request a place to rest. The scallop shell or the pilgrim's cross sewn onto their cloak became their most eloquent statement, a silent shout that declared their holy purpose and asked for mercy. This universal sign language, born of pure necessity, bound them to the common people they met along the way, a fragile thread of understanding woven through shared human need. For more complex communication, they relied on the one constant in this sea of linguistic chaos, the Latin of the Church. Within the stone walls of any monastery, from the Rhineland to the Pyrenees, the language of prayer and scripture was the same. A pilgrim could knock on a monastery gate, and even if they were a lowly peasant who knew only a few phrases, they could recite a Paternoster or an Ave Maria. This shared ritual language was a key that unlocked doors, a proof of shared faith that transcended all earthly borders. The monks who heard it understood immediately that this was a soul on a sacred path, and the offer of bread and shelter would follow. This created a kind of spiritual passport, a way to navigate the world using the rhythms of a faith they all held in common. And on the road itself, a remarkable thing happened. Pilgrims from England, Germany, France, and Italy, all walking the same path, would inevitably form temporary polyglot communities. They could not hold a deep conversation about philosophy or politics, but they shared everything else. They shared the heat of the sun on their backs, the ache in their feet, the terror of a lightning storm on an open plain, and the profound relief of spotting a town in the distance. They shared their meager food, pointed out dangers to one another, and sat in companionable silence around a shared fire at night. In these fleeting groups, a new, hybrid language would emerge, a pidgin of mixed words and expressive gestures for road, food, danger, and sanctuary. They became a moving village, a society of strangers bound not by a common past but by a common destination. Their community was built not on words but on shared hardship and a single, unifying purpose that needed no translation. A pilgrim's belly was a hollow space, a constant companion on the road. Their physical hunger was a gnawing reality, met with a diet as simple and hard as the path they walked. From their scrip came a daily ration of black bread, baked days or weeks before and now tough as wood, requiring soaking in water or ale to be edible. This was supplemented by hard cheese, a wedge of which could last for days, and perhaps salted fish or a strip of dried meat, precious sources of protein that would not spoil. They drank not water, which was often unsafe, but weak, sour ale, a liquid that provided calories and a small measure of sanitation. This was not a diet for pleasure, but for pure, grim endurance, a way to keep the body moving when the spirit was at its weakest. Yet, even as their bodies were pared down to their essentials, their souls were offered a richer, more sustaining feast. The rhythm of their days was set not by the sun alone, but by the canonical hours of prayer. At dawn, noon, and dusk, whether in a forest clearing or on a windswept hill, they would stop and recite the psalms they had memorized since childhood. The familiar Latin verses were a mental cloak against the strangeness of the world, a thread connecting them back to their home parish. And when the road granted them the ultimate gift of a wayside chapel, their meager existence was transformed. To step from the dusty road into the cool, dim silence of a stone chapel was to cross a threshold into another world. Here, the smell of damp stone and beeswax candles replaced the scent of sweat and earth. They would kneel on the cold floor, not as a peasant or a noble, but simply as a soul, and listen to the Mass. The priest's words, the same in this far-flung place as they were at home, were a balm. The taste of the communion wafer on their tongue was a nourishment that their hard bread could never provide. In these moments, the physical and the spiritual worlds met. The emptiness in their stomach was filled by the fullness in their heart, a reminder that they were walking not just toward a destination, but toward a state of grace. But the journey did not end at the cathedral door. The final act of a pilgrimage was not just prayer, but a purchase. Amid the echoing chants and the scent of incense, pilgrims would approach a small stall, handing over a few precious coins for a tiny, mass-produced token. These were the pilgrim badges, small emblems crafted from cheap lead or tin, and they are one of the most intimate windows we have into the medieval mind. For the pilgrim, this small object was far more than a simple souvenir. It was a physical certificate, an undeniable proof that they had completed their epic journey. Sewn onto their hat or cloak, it transformed their pilgrim's uniform from a suit of hopeful intention into a badge of proven accomplishment. Anyone who saw it would know that this person had walked to Compostela or Rome or Canterbury and had fulfilled their sacred vow. But its purpose ran much deeper than mere bragging rights. In a world alive with spiritual forces, this badge was a powerful amulet. It was believed to be imbued with the holy power of the shrine itself, a permanent, portable piece of the sacred. A pilgrim who had touched the reliquary of St. Thomas Becket would wear a badge depicting his murder. They were not glorifying violence, they were carrying a piece of that martyr's transformative power. A mother might pin such a badge to her child's clothing to ward off fever, or a farmer might nail one to his barn to protect his livestock. The iconography on these badges is a direct line to popular medieval belief. We see scenes of miracles, portraits of saints, and even playful, sometimes crude, symbols that spoke to the everyday hopes and fears of common people. A badge from a shrine known for curing blindness might show a pair of eyes. Another, from a site dedicated to safe childbirth, might show a swaddled infant. These were not just pictures, they were visual prayers, a way to carry the specific miracle they had come to seek back into their daily lives. And this points to a final, fascinating layer, the bustling commerce of faith. The Church authorized the production and sale of these badges, creating a thriving industry that employed metalworkers and vendors. This was the meeting point of deep devotion and straightforward economics. The pilgrimage was a spiritual economy where the coin of a peasant could purchase a sliver of divine grace, made tangible in a piece of cheap, blessed metal. These humble objects, now dug from the mud of ancient streets, tell a silent story of a journey's end, a faith made solid, and a hope carried home. The world through a pilgrim's eyes was not a dead, mechanical place, but a living manuscript written by the hand of God. Every rustle in the bushes, every unusual cloud formation, every vivid dream was a potential message from the divine, a sign to be decoded with a mixture of hope and terror. For a soul stripped of all worldly comforts and walking through an alien landscape, the veil between this world and the next was worn dangerously thin. A sudden chill on a warm day was not just a change in weather, it was the passing of an unseen spirit. The call of an unfamiliar bird in a deep forest could be an angel's warning or a demon's mockery. In this state of heightened awareness, the supernatural was not a belief, it was a daily reality. Some pilgrims told of seeing a faint, shimmering light moving through the trees just ahead of them, a will-o, the wisp that some feared as a malevolent trickster, but others followed as a guiding spirit sent by their patron saint. These were not hallucinations born of hunger, but genuine experiences interpreted through a lens of deep, pervasive faith. The road itself seemed to speak. A pilgrim lost in a mountain pass might dream of a specific gnarled oak tree. Waking in despair, they would crest a ridge and see that very tree, and beneath its branches find the path they had lost. Such an event was not coincidence, it was a direct answer to a desperate prayer, a miracle of guidance that strengthened their resolve for 100 more miles. More dramatic still were the accounts of direct encounters. A lone traveler fending off a wolf with a trembling staff would later swear that a figure in shining armor appeared for just a moment, causing the beast to flee. They had met Saint Michael, the archangel himself, protector of travelers. Another, collapsing from thirst in a barren land, would be awakened by an old woman offering a drink from a wooden cup, only to find her vanished and a spring of fresh water bubbling from the spot where she had stood. They had been saved by Saint Martha or perhaps a local forest spirit, the distinction often blurred in the popular imagination. Dreams were the most common and most powerful of these supernatural encounters. A pilgrim plagued by doubt might dream of a deceased relative bathed in light who would urge them to continue their journey. A sinner wrestling with a guilty conscience might be visited by the saint whose shrine they sought, offering a silent gesture of forgiveness that would wash away years of shame. These nightly visions were the compass of the soul, recalibrating their inner direction when the outer path grew confusing or hopeless. To interpret an omen was to read the secret language of the universe. A hawk circling overhead could be a sign of God's watchful eye or a portent of coming conflict. The discovery of a perfect, unbroken snail shell on the path might be a miniature version of their own scallop shell, a private blessing for the road ahead. Every strange event was a piece of a puzzle, and the pilgrim's faith was the key that made the picture clear. Their journey was not just a physical test, but a constant, whispered conversation with an unseen world, a soft-voiced tale where every shadow held a potential message and every footstep fell on holy ground. Yet even the guidance of spirits could not protect a pilgrim from the most visceral terror of the medieval world, the creeping shadow of disease. The road was a vector for sickness, a place where bodies, weakened by exhaustion and poor diet, were left vulnerable to a host of invisible enemies. The most common was the bloody flux, dysentery, a brutal infection of the gut spread through contaminated food and water. A pilgrim suffering from this ailment faced a special kind of agony, their strength draining away with each painful, desperate stop by the roadside. In marshy regions, the evening air brought malaria, the ague, with its cycles of burning fever and bone-rattling chills that could leave a traveler shivering in a ditch, delirious and alone. Medical knowledge offered little comfort. A local barber surgeon might attempt to balance the body's humors through bloodletting, a practice that often weakened a patient further. Herbal remedies provided some relief, but against infections and epidemics they were nearly powerless. The true horror, the one that stalked the nightmares of every soul on the road, was the Black Death. Rumors of its approach moved faster than any traveler, whispers of towns where the bells had stopped ringing because there was no one left to pull the ropes. To see a dark bubo the size of an apple swelling in a person's armpit or groin was to see a death sentence written on the body itself. In this atmosphere of helpless dread, pilgrims turned to specific saints as their heavenly physicians. Saint Roch became their particular guardian, invoked against the plague itself. His story was one they could understand, a pilgrim who had contracted the disease and been saved by a dog that brought him bread each day. To pray to Saint Roch was to beg for that same miraculous intervention, for a sign of mercy in a merciless time. And then there were the pest houses, the most terrifying sight on the horizon. These were isolation huts, often just beyond the town walls, places where the sick and dying were taken to languish and die, separated from the community to halt the spread of contagion. The smoke from their fires carried a foul scent, and the sounds that sometimes drifted from them were enough to make a pilgrim quicken their pace and pray they would not be the next soul ordered inside. To fall ill was to risk not just death, but to die as an outcast, your sacred journey ending not at a golden altar, but on a filthy straw pallet, your final view not a holy relic, but a wall of rough-hewn wood. This was the ultimate test of faith, to keep walking toward salvation even as the world itself seemed to be rotting around you. Beneath the surface of pure devotion, the pilgrim's path was also a stage for the powerful. A king, clad in the simple robes of a penitent walking barefoot toward a distant shrine, was not just saving his soul, he was performing a masterful act of public relations, demonstrating humility and piety to his subjects and rivals alike. This was power dressed in the cloak of faith. When a nobleman was ordered on pilgrimage by the church as penance for a violent crime, it was a political solution as much as a spiritual one. It removed a troublesome figure from the kingdom without the messy business of execution or imprisonment, allowing the ruler to maintain stability while publicly submitting to the church's moral authority. The journey itself became a form of sanctioned exile, a way to let tensions cool back home. For rulers embroiled in conflict, a pilgrimage could even serve as a strategic pause, a public gesture of peacemaking that masked the regrouping of armies or the brokering of secret alliances. The road was not just for souls seeking grace, it was for kings mending their political fortunes. The Church, in its wisdom, understood this dynamic perfectly and wielded the pilgrimage as a tool of immense soft power. By promoting certain routes and shrines, the Church could direct the flow of people, wealth, and ideas across Europe, consolidating its cultural and economic influence. The road to Santiago de Compostela, for instance, was not just a spiritual highway. It was a project that helped consolidate Christian power in Spain during the Reconquista, bringing wealth and settlers to the region. The Church controlled the narrative too. The sale of indulgences, which promised a reduction of time in purgatory for those who visited certain shrines, was a theological innovation with a very practical outcome. It filled the Church's coffers and cemented its role as the essential gatekeeper to salvation. This system turned faith into a kind of spiritual economy with the Church as its central bank. By authorizing which relics were genuine and which pilgrim badges were blessed, the institution maintained a monopoly on divine access, ensuring that every step a pilgrim took ultimately reinforced the power of Rome. And then there were those who walked the path in shadow, their rosaries hiding darker purposes. The pilgrim's guise was the perfect cover for a spy. Who would suspect the weary, prayerful traveler huddled in a monastery guesthouse of being an agent for a distant king? These covert pilgrims carried messages, mapped terrain, and gauged the loyalty of border lords, all under the sacred protection of their pilgrim's cloak. Diplomats, too, used the pilgrimage as a pretext for sensitive travel. A meeting between two rival powers could be arranged at a neutral shrine, far from prying eyes in capital cities. Their discussions, framed by the aura of holy ground, could proceed under the pretense of shared devotion. Even merchants on pilgrimage doubled as intelligence gatherers, noting fortifications, troop movements, and the economic health of the regions they passed through. The scallop shell could hide a multitude of secrets. For every 10 genuine souls, there was perhaps one whose prayers were a carefully rehearsed lie, whose eyes were not fixed on the heavens but scanning the earthly landscape for weakness and opportunity. The road to redemption was, for some, just a road to power. A pilgrim's greatest weapon was not their staff but knowledge, and in the 12th century that knowledge arrived in the form of a book, the Codex Calixtinus. This was not a simple prayer book but a comprehensive guide for the journey to Santiago de Compostela, a detailed manual for survival that feels remarkably modern in its practical concerns. Imagine holding a volume that told you which rivers had water safe to drink, which stretches of road were haunted by thieves, and which local innkeepers were known to cheat travelers. This book was all of that and more. It was the world's first known travel guide, a collection of advice, miracles, and liturgical texts compiled under the name of Pope Calixtus II, offering a lifeline of information to thousands of souls setting out into the unknown. Its 5th book, known as The Pilgrim's Guide, is the real treasure, a step-by-step itinerary written by someone who had clearly walked the road themselves. The author warns pilgrims about the river in Navarre known to kill the horses that drink from it. He describes the Basque people, whose strange language he compares to the barking of dogs, and cautions travelers to be on their guard in their territory. He even offers culinary advice, praising the fish and the bread in certain regions while scornfully dismissing the wine in another area as barbarous, tainted with pitch and undrinkable. This was not abstract spiritual guidance. It was the gritty, necessary intelligence for a journey where a bad meal or a dishonest host could mean the difference between life and death. The guide even details the architecture of the great churches along the route, pointing out which altars held the most powerful relics and where a pilgrim should stop to offer a specific prayer. It created a mental map of the sacred landscape, transforming an intimidating, chaotic continent into a series of known waypoints, each with its own rewards and dangers. This book democratized the pilgrimage. A poor farmer from France could now access the same hard-won knowledge as a wealthy cleric, learning which local saints to venerate and which treacherous mountain passes to cross with caution. The Codex Calixtinus was more than parchment and ink. It was a companion for the road, a whisper from 1,000 previous travelers, ensuring that the soft-voiced tale of one pilgrim could guide the steps of countless others. Then the horizon began to change. For days, the sight of other pilgrims had grown from a trickle into a river, all flowing in the same direction, their faces etched with a shared, weary anticipation. And then, one morning, a fellow traveler on the path ahead would stop, their staff falling forgotten to the ground, and simply point. There, in the far distance, stood the spires. They were not just stone, they were a promise made solid, piercing the sky after months or even years of walking. The final miles were a blur of rising emotion, the path now paved with the hopes of millions who had walked it before. The city walls swelled into view, and the air itself began to transform. The clean scent of earth and forest was replaced by the thick, human smell of crowded streets, of roasting meat from food stalls, and the unmistakable, sweet perfume of incense that drifted from the cathedral like a visible prayer. The sound was overwhelming, a roaring symphony of life. Hawkers cried out in a dozen languages, offering food, lodging, and souvenirs. The constant shuffle of countless feet on stone was underscored by the distant, rhythmic tolling of the great bell, a deep, resonant voice calling them home. As they pressed through the crowded streets, the colossal facade of the cathedral rose before them, a carved stone Bible telling stories of saints and salvation. They would pass through the great portal, often a massive sculpture of the Last Judgment, and step from the noisy, sunlit world into another universe entirely. The change was absolute. The cacophony of the city vanished, swallowed by a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of old stone and beeswax. The only light filtered down from high, stained glass windows, painting the vast, echoing space in pools of ruby, sapphire, and gold, and then the chanting would begin. The Gregorian chant of the monks was not a song you heard with your ears alone. It was a vibration you felt in your bones, a wave of sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones, a direct line to the divine. This was the moment of culmination. The pilgrim, now just one soul in a sea of humanity, would join the slow, shuffling queue moving toward the high altar. This was the final steps of their journey, a slow procession toward the object of all their suffering and hope. As they drew closer, they could see it, the glittering reliquary that held the bones of the saint. The emotional dam, built over hundreds of miles and countless trials, would finally break. Grown men would weep without shame. Women would fall to their knees, their whispered prayers lost in the vast chant. This was not a quiet piety. It was a raw, unrestrained spiritual ecstasy, a physical release of every fear, every pain, every doubt they had carried on their backs since leaving home. To touch the cold, hard surface of the shrine was to complete a circuit. The power they had traveled so far to find flowed back through them, a palpable sensation of grace that washed away the grime of the road and the weight of their old life. In that single, transcendent moment, every blister, every hungry night, every moment of terror was redeemed. They had arrived. The line to the reliquary was a river of human longing. For hours, the pilgrim would shuffle forward on stone floors worn smooth by centuries of hopeful feet, the murmur of 1,000 prayers rising like a mist around them. This slow, deliberate procession was not a wait, but the final, essential stage of the journey, a time to gather every fear, every sin, and every desperate wish into a single, focused plea. When they finally reached the front, the world narrowed to the glittering casket before them. This was the moment of contact, the ritual that justified every hardship. They did not merely look, they reached out a trembling hand to touch the cold metal of the reliquary. Inside lay a fragment of a saint's bone, a splinter from the true cross, or a thread from the Virgin's veil. In our modern world, we might see only an artifact, but to the medieval pilgrim, this was a conduit to heaven itself. They believed the saint's spiritual power was physically present in their earthly remains, a sacred energy that could flow directly from the relic into their own body and soul. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a transaction of divine grace. A mother who had walked for months to save her sick child would press her forehead against the metal, transferring her love and fear into that touch, begging for the saint's intercession. A knight burdened by the blood he had spilled would grasp the casket, his grip tight, as if he could physically wring forgiveness from the saint's bones. The air crackled with this raw, unvarnished faith. You could hear it in the choked sobs of relief, the whispered confessions, the joyous cries of those who claimed to feel a sudden warmth flooding their limbs, a sign their prayers for healing had been answered. This single touch was the completion of their sacred contract. It was the moment a lifetime of sin was absolved, a broken body was made whole, or a heart shattered by grief was mysteriously, miraculously reassembled. The pilgrimage was over, the goal was reached. In that touch, the long road finally ended, and a new road, the journey home, could begin. But the touch of the reliquary was not an ending. It was a turning point. The pilgrim now faced a journey they had scarcely considered during their long walk toward grace, the long road home. They turned their back on the soaring spires and began to retrace their steps, but they were not the same person who had first set out. Their feet walked the same path, yet their soul carried a different weight. The world looked familiar, but their eyes now saw it through a lens polished by hardship and revelation. They were a living bridge between the sacred and the mundane, carrying the aura of the distant shrine back into the heart of their ordinary village. This return was as profound a test as the pilgrimage itself, a slow reintegration into a life that had learned to live without them. The pilgrim who had begged for bread was now a minor authority, a person who had witnessed miracles and walked with kings. Their simple pilgrim's badge, sewn firmly to their cloak, was no longer a plea for charity, but a shield of accomplishment, a silent sermon that commanded a new kind of respect. Villagers who had waved a hesitant goodbye months or years before would now gather around, their eyes wide, begging for stories, and what stories they had to tell. They could describe the impossible height of the Pyrenees, the taste of foreign wine, the sound of a language that had no words for home. They spoke of the kindness of strangers in distant lands and the cold terror of a bandit's ambush. Most of all, they spoke of the moment of touch, the divine stillness in the cathedral, a feeling they struggled to capture with mere words. In the telling, the journey was relived and sanctified, its lessons woven into the fabric of local memory. Yet this new status came with a strange isolation. How could they explain the profound silence of a monastery dawned to a family whose world was defined by the clatter of the mill wheel? How could they describe a soul scoured clean by penance to neighbors concerned with the price of barley? The pilgrim had been unmoored from their old life, and fitting back into its rigid shape was a quiet agony. The daily routines felt smaller, the conversations more trivial. They had been tempered by the road, their spirit stretched to encompass a continent, and now they were asked to shrink back into the confines of a single field, a single street, a single, unchanging horizon. Some never fully readjusted. A restlessness remained in their hearts, a longing for the open road and the community of strangers bound by a single purpose. They might become the village mystic, sought out for blessings and advice, a permanent stranger in their own home. Others poured their transformed perspective into their work, seeing their craft as a new form of prayer, their labor an offering to the God who had guided them home. The pilgrimage did not end at the shrine. It echoed through the rest of their days, a soft-voiced tale that reshaped not just one life, but the life of an entire community, forever altered by the return of the one who had gone to the edge of the world and back. The echo of their footsteps has long since faded, but the pilgrims themselves left behind a trail of silent testimony, waiting in the earth for centuries. Modern archaeology now gathers these whispers, piecing together the tangible reality of their epic journeys. We no longer have to rely solely on ancient texts to understand their world. We can hold fragments of their lives in our hands. The most poignant of these finds are the humble pilgrim badges, those small lead tokens purchased at the shrines. Excavated from the mud of old riverbanks and the foundations of medieval towns, they are more than just lost property. Finding one in a city far from its origin, like a badge from Canterbury unearthed in a Dutch fishing village, maps a real person's return route home, a tiny metallic dot connecting 2 points on a vast continental journey. Aerial photography reveals another kind of evidence, the ghostly imprint of the roads themselves. From high above, the faint, parallel lines of sunken paths become visible in fields and pastures, the collective memory of countless feet and hooves wearing the earth down over hundreds of years. These are not modern roads, they are desire paths, the most direct routes between 2 points of sanctuary, etched into the very landscape by faith and fatigue. The most intimate evidence, however, comes from the pilgrims' own bodies. Skeletal remains from cemeteries along the great routes tell a story written in bone. Archaeologists find signs of repetitive stress, of skeletons that walked for a lifetime. There are arthritic knees, spines curved from the constant weight of a pack, and telltale stress fractures in the feet. These are not the bodies of people who lived and died in one place, but of those who covered immense distances on foot. The final, and perhaps most astonishing, proof comes from a science that reads the very chemistry of their bones. Isotopic analysis examines the unique signature of elements like strontium and oxygen in tooth enamel and bone. Since these elements are absorbed from local food and water, they act as a geological passport. A skeleton buried in England, for instance, might have an isotopic signature matching the Pyrenees, proving that this individual spent their formative years or their final months in a distant land. We can now look at a set of bones and say with scientific certainty, this person was not from here, they were a traveler. Each of these lines of evidence, the metal badge, the worn path, the weary bone, and the chemical signature, converges to form a single, undeniable truth. These were not mythical figures from a soft-voiced tale, but real people of flesh and blood, whose extraordinary devotion literally reshaped the world, leaving a mark we are only now learning to read. The pilgrim's journey did not end with their return home. It was just beginning its transformation into legend. Medieval artists and writers became the keepers of these stories, translating the raw, dusty reality of the road into works of breathtaking beauty and wit that would shape the very soul of Europe for centuries. Walk into any great cathedral and look up at the walls. High above, in vibrant frescoes and stained glass, you would see their tales unfolding. A pilgrim, depicted with their staff and shell, is shown being guided by a glowing angel through a dark wood or kneeling in ecstasy before a golden reliquary. These were not mere decorations, they were visual sermons for a largely illiterate population. They showed the divine reward awaiting those who undertook the sacred journey, making the abstract idea of grace something you could see with your own eyes. In the quiet scriptoriums of monasteries, monks bent over illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly illustrating pilgrimage guides like the Codex Calixtinus with intricate maps and scenes of miracles. These pages were alive with color, showing the very roads and rivers a pilgrim would cross, making the daunting journey feel charted and holy before a single step was even taken. Art provided the divine blueprint for the pilgrimage, an ideal of faith made visible. But literature, most famously in the hands of Geoffrey Chaucer, gave us the pilgrims themselves in all their glorious, flawed humanity. His Canterbury Tales is perhaps the most perfect reflection of the pilgrimage ever created, not as a sacred ideal, but as a vibrant human experience. He gathers a group of 29 pilgrims at a London inn, all setting out for the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. But instead of describing their piety, he introduces us to the knight, the miller, the wife of Bath, and the pardoner, each with their own hidden motives, worldly desires, and sharp tongues. The pilgrimage here is not a solitary quest, it is a social melting pot. The high-born and the lowly are thrown together on the road, their conversations and stories revealing the bustling, chaotic, and often hilarious reality of medieval life. The devout knight tells a chivalric romance, while the drunken miller follows with a bawdy fabliau. The pardoner, a church official who sells fake relics, openly brags about his own greed and hypocrisy, proving that even the sacred journey could be corrupted by earthly vices. Chaucer's genius was to hold up a mirror to the entire institution. He showed that pilgrimage was not just about reaching a shrine, it was about the community formed along the way. The tales they tell to pass the time are a panorama of human experience from the noble to the profane. This masterpiece did not just report on the culture of pilgrimage, it actively shaped it, reminding everyone that the path to salvation was walked by real, complicated people, each carrying their own unique bundle of sins and hopes. Together, the art in the churches and the stories in the books created a powerful dialogue. One presented the divine framework of the journey, the other filled it with the beating hearts and ringing laughter of those who walked it. They ensured the pilgrim's tale was never forgotten, immortalizing not just the destination, but the wonderfully human mess of the road itself. A man named Thomas walks the same sun-baked path in northern Spain, a modern backpack strapped to his shoulders where a leather scrip once hung. He is not fleeing plague or performing penance for a violent sin. He left his job in software design, a life of digital certainty, seeking something he could not name. His feet, clad in scientifically engineered boots, still ache on the same Roman roads. He still sleeps in crowded albergues, the modern equivalent of a monastery's guest house, sharing food and stories with strangers from a dozen different countries. The fundamental architecture of the journey remains unchanged, a body moving through a landscape toward a distant, symbolic goal. The human need to walk away from one life in hopes of finding another has not vanished, it has simply changed its costume. The medieval pilgrim carried a vial of holy water. Thomas carries a smartphone. He uses it to check the weather forecast, to translate a menu, to text his family that he is safe. This is the most profound contrast, the utter collapse of the unknown. The medieval travelers stepped into a void, their fate a mystery from one day to the next. Thomas walks with a digital map in his pocket, the entire route and its amenities charted and reviewed. The terror of bandits has been replaced by the minor annoyance of a lost charging cable. Yet when a sudden storm descends on the Meseta, the high plains of Spain, the technological veil is torn away. The wind howls with the same voice that chilled a pilgrim 700 years ago. The driving rain soaks through his high-tech jacket just as it once seeped through coarse wool. In that moment of raw exposure, the centuries fold together and the journey becomes the same primal test of endurance. Why do people still do this? The motivations have shifted from the divine to the personal, from a plea for salvation to a search for clarity, for healing from a broken heart, for an answer to a quiet, persistent dread about the meaning of a modern life. They come not to touch a saint's bone, but to touch a part of themselves that has been silenced by the noise of the world. They seek the same transformation, not through divine intercession, but through the slow, rhythmic alchemy of putting one foot in front of the other for weeks on end. The destination, the cathedral at Santiago, still holds power, but for many it is the final period on a sentence they have been writing with their own footsteps. The real miracle is no longer waiting in the reliquary. It is discovered in the quiet conversations, the shared blisters, the stunning sunrises earned after a day of grueling effort. The medieval pilgrim returned home with a badge to prove where they had been. The modern pilgrim hopes to return with a new perspective, a quieter mind, a story not of a saint but of their own resilience. The road still offers its ancient bargain. Trade your comfort for a chance to find out who you are when everything familiar is left behind. For every pilgrim who returned home with a story and a scallop shell, countless others simply vanished. They walked over the horizon and never walked back, their final fate a quiet mystery swallowed by the centuries. These are the lost ones, the vanished pilgrims, whose stories end not with a homecoming but with a question mark. Some undoubtedly found a new life along the way. A peasant from a rain-sodden English village, having never known anything but his lord's field, might reach a sun-drenched town in southern France and decide to stay. The climate was kinder, the local lord was hiring laborers, and the weight of his old life felt too heavy to carry back. He would shed his pilgrim's cloak, assimilate into a new community, and his family back home would forever wonder if he had found heaven or simply a better plot of earth. Others fell to the road's relentless dangers. A solitary traveler taking a wrong turn in a dense forest could meet a bandit's knife, their body left in a ditch for the animals. Their family would wait for years, staring down the empty road, their hope slowly curdling into a silent grief. Disease was a swift and anonymous killer. A pilgrim succumbing to fever in a crowded pest house would be buried in a mass grave outside the town walls, their name unrecorded, their journey ended just a few miles from their goal. And for those brave or desperate enough to attempt the sea voyage to Jerusalem, the Mediterranean was a watery grave. A sudden storm, a hidden reef, or an encounter with pirates could send a ship to the bottom, taking every soul and every story with it. These disappearances left haunting voids in the communities left behind. A wife became a widow without a body to bury. Children grew up with a ghost for a father. The village priest would eventually stop saying prayers for their safe return and begin praying for the repose of their soul. The mystery of their end became a part of local folklore, a soft-voiced tale of a loved one who went to find God and simply got lost. These unanswered questions are the dark counterpart to the triumphant homecomings, a reminder that for all its spiritual promise, the Pilgrim's Road was a gamble with life itself, and many who set out with boundless faith ultimately paid the final price. These ancient footpaths did far more than guide souls to salvation. They quietly charted the future of a continent, weaving a new cultural and economic fabric across a divided Europe. The constant river of pilgrims created a financial lifeline for countless towns and villages along the routes. A small hamlet that happened to lie on the road to Santiago could find itself transformed. Blacksmiths prospered repairing staffs and shoeing horses. Bakers and brewers worked day and night to feed the endless stream of travelers. Inns expanded, and local farmers found a ready market for their cheese, bread, and wine. This was not a trickle-down economy. It was a direct infusion of coin and commerce that built bridges, funded new churches, and lifted entire regions from poverty. The pilgrimage routes became Europe's first great economic engines, powered not by industry but by faith. Along with money, these roads carried something even more precious: ideas. A stonemason from Burgundy walking to Compostela might spend a week working at a cathedral in Leon to earn a few coins, bringing his unique style of carving with him. He would then return home with new architectural designs blossoming in his mind. This is how the Romanesque style, with its rounded arches and massive walls, slowly gave way to the soaring heights of Gothic architecture across the continent. The pilgrim roads were a network of cultural exchange, transmitting music, art, and storytelling styles from one region to another long before the age of universities or printing presses. This constant flow of people also forced the creation of the world's first international travel protections. The Church declared the peace of God and the truce of God, threatening excommunication for anyone who harmed a pilgrim. Kings and local lords, recognizing the economic benefits of the traffic through their lands, began to grant safe conduct, ensuring travelers could pass without being robbed or imprisoned. This established a radical new principle that a traveler, under the sacred sign of the scallop shell or the cross, held a special status that transcended local laws and petty wars. The pilgrim, in their humble cloak, was the unwitting architect of a new, more connected Europe. They carried not just prayers in their hearts, but the seeds of commerce, art, and law in their footsteps, laying the groundwork for the world we recognize today, a world where a journey can still redefine a life and reshape a civilization. Their footsteps have faded into the dust of 1,000 years, but the echo of their journey remains. The medieval pilgrim's path was both an epic trek across a continent and the most intimate of human prayers. It was a story written in blistered feet and desperate hope, a testament to a courage born not from a desire for conquest, but from a profound faith that somewhere beyond the horizon, grace was waiting. They walked through a world of tangible dangers and invisible spirits, driven by a yearning for meaning that is as timeless as the human heart itself. They sought miracles, atonement, and answers, and in their relentless movement, they found something perhaps even more valuable: the transformative power of the journey itself. Their soft-voiced tale reminds us that the search for something greater, for a connection that mends a broken spirit, is a thread woven through all of history. It is a quest that continues in every soul who sets out, whether on a physical road or a personal path of discovery, looking for a little more light in the world. What journeys, great or small, are calling to you? We would be honored to hear your own stories in the comments below.